Hi, I'm here to talk to you today about the new Vehicle Efficiency Standard, or NVES, and particularly its impact on the automotive aftermarket. So the NVES is a federal government legislated scheme that essentially imposes a carbon trading tax on vehicle manufacturers on vehicles that they bring into the Australian market. And what it does is it sets a benchmark limit of CO2 emissions per kilometre for every vehicle brought in. And the vehicle manufacturers, if they bring in a vehicle that's above the benchmark, then they incur debits on every vehicle sold. And similarly, if they bring in zero and low emission vehicles that are under the limit, then they incur credits. And essentially what they do is they offset the credits against the debits. And if they end up in debit on the vehicles sold, then they either need to buy credits off other manufacturers that have surplus credits, or they need to pay a fine. And the fine is pretty significant. It's $100 per gram per vehicle over the limit. So those vehicle manufacturers that aren't able to offset with lower emission vehicles are really going to struggle, and they'll incur significant taxes or penalties on the vehicles they bring in. I will say at the outset that the AAAA and the wider industry support, in principle, a vehicle emissions standard. It really is the only way for governments to force car companies to prioritise a particular market with the latest technology. And we don't want Australia to be a dumping ground for old technology in vehicles. But having said that, the argument really is around where that benchmark is set and the time frame to get there, because we all know that vehicle manufacturers can't change their powertrains overnight. And that's where I think the industry has a real problem with where the government's gone on this. They've gone for some very ambitious targets in terms of that emission standard and a very ambitious time frame. So essentially what the government will do is on the commencement of the scheme, they'll set a limit, and then that limit will reduce by 10% a year for every year out from 2025 out to 2030. And if the government achieves their target, passenger vehicles sold in 2030 will have 60% lower emissions on average than vehicles sold today, and light commercial vehicles are 50%. So these are major reductions in the emission output of vehicles being sold in the market. So what effect is that going to have? What we've seen is independent analysis has shown that at least 50% of the car brands selling cars into Australia are going to have to make significant changes to their model lineup and their powertrains to be able to comply with this legislation. And when we talk about 50% of the manufacturers, the majority of those manufacturers are those volume brands selling vehicles into the market. So what we are going to see inevitably is changes in vehicle model lineup and potentially, and I think inevitably, those higher emitting vehicles are going to be more expensive because there's going to be essentially a tax or fine component to those vehicles. Really the only saving grace here is that there is the legislation comes into effect on 1 January next year, which is a very short time frame, but there won't be any trading until July next year. 1st of July is when the actual trading starts, and each of the manufacturers has 2 years to be able to offset any debits with credits. So it's going to take a year or two for things to bed down and for any vehicle manufacturers to incur and pay fines. But it is going to have a significant impact on the vehicles available and the time frame. I've also got to say that we're one of the last developed countries to introduce a vehicle efficiency standard. And what we've seen around the world is governments everywhere go very, very hard, like the Australian government has. But those that are a little more advanced from a time frame perspective are now seeing the impacts of that from a consumer point of view. And governments are feeling some real political pain. And in many cases, particularly in the US, in Europe, in New Zealand, the UK, governments are now walking back the targets because they were too ambitious. So we think that is probably the likelihood here, because we think the targets are too ambitious. In terms of what the AAAA is doing, at the moment our focus is on lobbying the government to make sure that they not only just put this in and really force car companies to bring in EVs and hybrid vehicles, but the government needs to put some investment into the training and infrastructure and equipment required to be able to service and maintain those vehicles. So that's a big focus of the AAA. Secondly, we are looking for manufacturing opportunities for our industry in that EV and hybrid space, and we think there is some opportunities for Australian industry. But ultimately, I think as this policy unfolds and consumers start to feel the impacts of it, we think that public sentiment will turn against this policy, and at that time we will join the rest of the industry to lobby for more realistic standards, because we think the government has gone too hard too fast with this one. So it's an important policy. It's something to watch. There is going to be quite a bit of flux in the new car industry over the next couple of years, unfortunately. But the AAAA has a seat at the table, and we'll make sure that our voice is heard with government, and we'll make sure that we keep you updated progressively on this as it rolls out.